So today I'm gonna share a bit of the sort of conclusions and sort of the methods that I've been engaging with my work within my PhD here at Monash, talking a little bit about the going from an extraction to a relation. And this is a project that involves a multidisciplinary approach to foregrounding knowledge in the underground. And in particular, in my PhD is water knowledge in Melbourne. So first of all, I would like to introduce myself. I'm a Mexican mestiza. I was raised in this town in these pictures. It's a traditional town in the center of Mexico. It's called Tepoztlán. And this is where my identity and my belonging reside. However, my indigenous ancestry comes from the Otomí and the Nahua peoples of the highlands of Hidalgo, where my father's family comes from. It was through living in Tepoztlán, however, that I have become an active member of the community since I was a child. And I practice local customs according to the local lore all my life. And even though I'm 14,000 kilometers away from Tepoztlán's mountains, I continue to practice these customs. My purpose in this country is to understand my own position within my research and practice in Australia, and to care for a country as an uninvited guest through my relationships with invisible rivers. I acknowledge and pay my respects to the Boonwurrung people, to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and in whose lands my research is carried out, and in particular to Dr. and Elder Narwit Caroline Briggs, who has been collaborating in this research and sharing with me her knowledge and also her time. I would like to pay my respects as well to all Indigenous people who might be joining us today. Today, I'm unfortunately not in Melbourne. I'm in Ngunnawal country, so I would like to extend my respects to this country as well. So my PhD focuses on various forms of extractivism, extraction of resources for urban development, which has come through the displacement, filling, and draining of waterways in Melbourne, to the extraction of traditional knowledges about these waterways through the colonial settlement in this country. I focus particularly on waterways that cross between the boundaries of above and below ground as part of a multidisciplinary approach to exploring the underground. As part of this project, it was very important for me to understand what I mean when I say the underground, as it has different meanings for different people. This term has been commonly used in basically two ways. The first one is to define the physical space, which extends from the center of the earth, bounded by, but also including the ground, which itself can be thought of as the line between the atmosphere and the earth. And secondly, the underground can be used to describe things that are hidden or concealed, perhaps existing below or in marginalized relationship to the establishment. This second type of underground evokes to everything that operates or is situated below the surface, from clandestine economies and production that exist outside of the establishment to ideas and symbols that are invisible yet so important for the social fabric. I will also like to include all the social and cultural forms that have been repressed and subdued by colonial settlement and oppression. The repression and marginalization of these sociabilities are socially constructed by the dominant representation. The system of meanings, practices, values, and objects that constitutes the background horizon in which these populations exist and live remains invisible, thus underground, hidden, and covered up. Cultural sites that are made up by and containing meanings for humans, exist within the physical underground realm. A clear example of the underground cultural site is that of the burial, which contains both physical body of a deceased person, but also the meaning that has been applied to the site by beloved ones as a place of memorial. As Robert Macfarlane argues, physical burials evoke to the myths of life and death. Other examples include archaeological sites of historical importance, natural geographical elements, which relate to traditional knowledge and cosmology, or culturally significant waterways, which, although necessarily we can't see them, they are continuous between the above and below ground situations. In many cases, the physical underground overlaps with the metaphysic underground through the existence of physical sites of cultural significance that contain or embody repressed or forgotten memory and knowledge. Archaeological sites, for example, are often found by accident, as development attempts to overlap sites that have been previously inhabited, often the meaning and even purpose of these archaeological sites have been forgotten and can be revealed through the research and interpretation. In these pictures here is just an example of the discovery of the moon goddess Koyoushauki. The archaeological rescue was due to an electrical company trying to renew the electric system below the ground in the center of the city, Mexico City. And they bump into this massive stone, which sort of opened the Pandora box to the exploration of Templo Mayor, which is basically the city of the Aztec Empire. This obviously was, again, discovered in 1978. Archaeological projects are designed to research material culture in situ that is often found underground, but it still is bound by the limitations of accessibility and visibility. The history of other underground sites have been deliberately repressed. An example of this in Australia is the massacre sites, where violent historical events between European colonial settlers and Indigenous Australians led to the deaths of many Indigenous people. These sites have been covered up both physically with soil and in memory by telling an incomplete story. Both types of the underground, both the metaphysical and the intangible, cannot be seen. In the case of the physical underground, cultural sites are covered up by earth, pushed out of sight, often forgotten about and difficult to quantify, locate, and understand without exposing them. Intangible cultural sites, including those in the underground, exist in memory or unseen documents or stories that are also hard to see, quantify, and map. The below and the above spaces are differentiated in collective memory through the implication of meanings and symbolic attributes that show us a version of the history that foregrounds certain events. The underground becomes a discursive space that reveals untold stories of the city by hidden or repressed populations. So my research focuses on this overlap of the tangible and the intangible, sort of an in-betweenness of different ontologies, Western and Indigenous, and it operates across multiple disciplines: underground spatial planning and design, Indigenous research and frameworks, and ethnography, which is my academic background. Working within these fields, I've had to reflect upon the extractivism of resources in the underground, both tangible and intangible, of traditional land and water and knowledge in Australia, and of course, through my discipline, commodifying and objectifying the other. Considering these three fields requires an analysis of the gaps and complexities that each field conveys and how they can complement the knowledge that is yet to be explored or researched. Thinking about the underground as an Indigenous urban landscape results in the following considerations that I have drawn and analyzed from different scholars. The first is that the underground has been exploited as a blank space for human purposes, what geoanthropologist and tunnel research expert Dr. Marilu Melo calls sub terra nulles. This has led to unsustainable management of the underground that impacts the city and its cultures. Deep city scholars have rightfully stated that the cultures that have a connection to the underground have been repressed and restricted in the use of the underground. Yet, current approaches in the underground include its use for human-centric purposes or are managed by Western conceptions of heritage that do not acknowledge the Indigenous worldview. In Australia, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars pinpoint to the need to recognize Indigenous knowledges and practices in planning and design. So as seen in this slide, I've been using diagrams as a way to visualize what I'm doing, because I'm not an artist, as you can see. As you can see in this slide, these considerations have shared some light into the links, gaps, and debates between the different fields and the need to research them all together. So I've been exploring the urban waterscape of Southeast Melbourne through a relational design, which by practicing a set of acts that can be called, or I call them rituals, because it is a sort of a conscious act that brings us to a sacred conscience, if you want to call that. We can develop relationships with hidden waterways. I've been focusing on drained creeks and rivers that through this modernization period, and I want to say modernization again with these little quote marks, as I did with the discovery one before, because modernization is also a Western conception of time. So through this modernization period, Creeks, rivers, swamps, wetlands, and these were displaced, drained, and filled to accommodate the Western urban development of Melbourne. For example, in this slide, those who are in Melbourne could probably detect some of the contemporary urban landscape. And in blue are some of the old water bodies that characterize pre-colonial Melbourne, which have been filled, drained, displaced to extract and commodify the land for urban development in the last 2 centuries. To foreground this knowledge, I've been investigating the notion of deep time, exploring all maps, memories, diaries, photographs, and articles that can show us a pre-colonial landscape. However, I've been focusing on the sacred by deep listening to the stories, or also, as we know them, the dreaming, to account for Indigenous water knowledge of the area. This knowledge is owned and passed on by anti-Caroline bricks. Gathering all these different sort of ethnohistorical and oral sources involve mapping events throughout this landscape. And this is just a little glimpse of what it looked like. But I have been particularly focusing on water memory and how water comes back to places where it used to be, regardless of human infrastructures and changes in the geomorphology of the land. Water has got great memory, Narwit shares with me, and it will come back to places where it used to flow. However, even if water comes back and memories are kept, some important meanings of the waterscapes have been subdued in the experience of the city, which, as we can see here in this map, water sort of historically will come back to places where it used to flow. Sorry. To explore water memory in the city, I have been physically tracing these rivers through an immersive walking method, where I follow the water and not the city map. This allows for one to experience water country, to meet the river, understanding its behaviors, see how it is part of country, but it also allows us to see how urban infrastructure cohabits with these rivers that you can hardly see. My own behavior and acknowledgement of these drained waterways has changed. Understanding how knowledge is fitting it into the landscape defies our Western conceptions of knowledge, access, and production. Now I walk hopping from drain to drain to try to hear their subtle voices. These walks have also been a space to yarn and learn the stories of Bumperun country shared by Narwit and Caroline Briggs, to learn and explore different ways of knowing and relating to her country. As you can see in this immersive methodology, which embraces a one-on-one exploration of methods and places, is part of what Indigenous scholars, such as Norman Sheehan, have called relational design. I have been basing my research on relational thinking to understand and care for country, even as an uninvited guest, which brings me to a few considerations, which is basically based on ethical considerations of extracting knowledge. My research has been looking at the colonial interventions that changed the landscape and continue to reproduce human-centered planning. In my explorations of working from an Indigenous paradigm, such as relationality, not only do I find it imperative to acknowledge country as a living entity we're all part of, but this notion makes us rethink how we engage with traditional knowledge and how could we rethink our practices to avoid this extraction of knowledge. So as an anthropologist, the ethical considerations of working within Indigenous communities have been widely discussed through the history of ethnographic work. So for example, social scientists such as Edward Said, John Urey, James Clifford, and George Marcus, among many others, have inspired a turn in the anthropological inquiry, a turn to be more reflective and critical on the way ethnography looks at the other as an object of study. While planning and design have usually gone through the pathway of consultation, which itself is a Western and extractive notion, in the crossing of disciplines of planning and design with anthropology and Indigenous frameworks, ethical considerations should be taken in order to self-regulate ourselves on the way knowledge and research are undertaken. So I want to ask you, sorry, my mouse is not working very well. Oh yeah. As we design and live in unceded lands, how can architecture planning and design go beyond extractivism? In his work, Research as Ceremony, Indigenous scholar Sean Wilson shares the multidimensionality of relatedness and how this entails relationships that go beyond human relations. He claims that knowledge is held in the relationships we have with environments that surround us. This includes the spiritual relations we create with the landscape, which is why he argues that research itself is a ceremony. He goes on further to explain that within Indigenous research, the ways we think and the ways we know are culturally based. Drawing from his work, I acknowledge too that my ways of thinking and knowing inform and impact my ways of doing. The use of epistemologies informed by my identity and culture enables a space for alterity that helps the research to move beyond binary oppositions, to be self-aware of how Western ideologies and theories have eroded relationships, and finally, to address issues of power. Indigenous educationist Karen Martin specifies that outsiders can achieve a fulfilling relationship where honesty, respect, and cooperation can be achieved while they maintain their own identity and autonomy. She states, so that relatedness is expanded and not diminished or replaced. There are many Indigenous guidelines and protocols to work with and alongside country and traditional owners. For example, the Australian Indigenous Design Charter, which for those of you interested in pursuing a path into Indigenous research might be a good way to start. But my research has shown me the importance of positionality and understanding where I sit in relation to country. Today, I share with you some of the considerations I've been working on several architectural studios here at Monash, but also throughout my research. Firstly, is to understand that as non-Indigenous Australians working in this land, we need to understand that we're not entitled to know everything, but we are responsible to care. Caring starts when relationships are built. When caring relationships are built, there is little opportunity for extractivism because caring involves a set of both relational and transactional acts that keeps country healthy. Relationships should not include only people, but more than human worlds. So for example, water, non-human beings, the hills, and everything that is country. In my research, for example, I focus on drained rivers. Relational design can aid in building relationships with country because being relational includes being relationally accountable, where personal and community values should be respected. For example, ideally, we can start to think of a code of ethics in each project. So asking ourselves, what is the purpose or the intent of the design? Where do we sit in the country system of relationality? How do we understand the time of country? Are we designing according to this time? How is it respecting the values of the community? How is it being transactional, among many others? And finally, if we consider more than human worlds as agents, our extractive practices would also be challenged and would have the same ethical considerations as people and country, because country temporalities inherently challenge the economic structures of architecture and planning. In the model of country, the cost is cultural, not merely economical, whereas in architecture and planning, the land is a commercial construct. In Indigenous worldview, land is a relational entity. We need to rethink how architecture and planning can facilitate both relational and transactional relationships with country that promote balance. So with this presentation, I hope I've inspired some of you to rethink the way you practice your discipline, how you relate to the lands and knowledges where you reside, and perhaps what are the gaps in our system of thinking and knowledge that can be filled when we become truly relational. I would like to finish with some words of wisdom that Auntie Caroline Briggs and myself have yarned about, basically encouraging indigenizing the research, which means that to decolonize our thinking, we must be less controlling to be able to open our minds to learn the ways. This can be achieved by understanding our own methods of relatedness. So for example, for me, it was walking and tracing rivers, deep listening, deep observing, reflecting, and many others. We shouldn't ask too many questions. Rather, we must spend time contemplating and reflecting to allow ourselves to make sense of the world on our own. And we must build relationships and nourish these relationships with all animated and unanimated things, because it's through these relationships that we can access the knowledge. I think with that, I'm going to finish. Thank you very much.